welcome. Is it the spring weather or is it the topic? It's the topic. Okay. Well, I am so happy to be here. I'm sorry that some people don't have chairs. As a presenter, it's thrilling to know that this many people are interested in the topic, but as a person standing, it might be a little uncomfortable. We'll darken the room, and if you want to sit on the floor, hey, good idea. Now, we're still looking for an alternate microphone here. Ah, that sounds like it's working. Okay. All right, so now I've got two gadgets attached to me. All right. So we're here to talk about shipwrecks. What is so fascinating about shipwrecks? She turned it off. No, that says off, that says on. You're hearing me now? Ah, okay. So what's so fascinating about shipwrecks? A couple people, call it out. History. Mystery, history, mystery, the artifacts. Oh, there's a lot of artifacts down there. You're going to see some. Stories of survival, sometimes not survival. I like the stories that end with everybody surviving. Those are my favorite. You can't hear me. Okay, I'm going to have to put this very close to my mouth. So now I'll look like I'm covering up my mouth, but you'll be able to hear me. The topic that I'm going to talk about tonight, Lost and Found Legendary Lake Michigan Shipwrecks, it's an idea that I had a number of years ago after a 30-year career studying shipwrecks, searching for them, finding them, documenting them archaeologically, and realizing that the stories of these ships don't end when they sink beneath the waves. The stories, the ships continue to live on as a variety of different things underwater. There's a lot of people, and you've probably been reading a number of books. I talked to somebody who read a book written about 40 years ago by William Radigan, Shipwrecks and Survivals. Great book. But the interesting thing about most of the books about shipwrecks is they don't talk about, what happened when the ship was found. Because oftentimes it's the mystery that these aren't found. But I've dedicated my career to researching and finding shipwrecks. You'll see a couple that I talk about where my team has discovered them. Little background on me, been interested in scuba diving since I was about 16, a little bit older than you guys down there. Had a fascination with the underwater world, and in short order I involved myself with a team of people. This was in Chicago where I grew up, and started a nonprofit there to find and document shipwrecks. When I moved over here to Michigan, you could probably tell by the last name that I married a Dutchman, and so I came this way rather than him coming that way. And he and I were both divers. We linked up with a number of other people interested in solving some of the great mysteries on this side of the lake. And we've been doing that for 18 years now, and formed a nonprofit Michigan Shipwreck Research Association. So I'm here both as an author and as a representative of that nonprofit. So if we can turn down the lights, we're going to venture back in time and deep beneath the lake to explore some of the great mysteries. I'm going to just press go here, and we'll get started. Titanic. The name has become synonymous with shipwreck since its tragic sinking in April 1912, when some 1,600 people perished in the North Atlantic. The disaster has been the object of fascination for many years. There have been 3 major waves of Titanic fever. First, right after its sinking, but that was soon overshadowed by the larger loss of life during World War I. The second wave came in the mid-1950s with the publication of the book, A Night to Remember, and the film of the same name, establishing Titanic's place. But not until 1985, when Robert Ballard discovered the wreck of Titanic, did the shipwreck become legendary. The images he captured of the massive and disarticulated hulk provided a potent physical reminder that this wasn't just a story, but something real and something terrible. That physical connection to the past made the story of Titanic all the more powerful. Closer to home, another disaster takes center stage alongside Titanic. You all know which one I'm referring to. The Edmund Fitzgerald lost on Lake Superior more than 39 years ago. Although not nearly the worst disaster on the Great Lakes, it stands out as famous because of the song. It'll go down in a minute. Gotta listen to the words. But like Titanic, the ship didn't become legendary until we got to see how the power of Mother Nature ripped apart that 729-foot ore carrier and discarded it onto the bottom, 550 feet below. I don't think it's going to be quite as loud now. So we're all gathered here today to remind us that besides the Titanic and the Edmund Fitzgerald, there are many more shipwrecks right here in our own backyard, about 30 miles that way. Some 6,000 shipwrecks by various counts have become total losses in these freshwater seas. As immigrants began settling in the Great Lakes region in the early 1800s, the lakes served as their highways. But with traffic and a little bad weather came tragedy. Almost 2,000 vessels have been lost on Lake Michigan alone during the 18th and 19th centuries. Think about that, 18 and 1900s. That's almost one shipwreck for every 15 square miles of lake bottom. These many shipwrecks rested in their submerged graves until a period following World War II, when the technology and equipment to locate and dive shipwrecks became available. By the early 1950s, adventure seekers were taking up the new sport of scuba diving, and for many, Lake Michigan became their amusement park. My own father was among those early divers, returning from the war where he served as an underwater demolition diver. He introduced me to the sport in my teens in the late 70s when we lived near the shores of Lake Michigan in the suburbs of Chicago. I soon learned that dozens and dozens of ships were wrecked off Chicago. That's where I became captivated with their stories. Over the last 30 years, I've had a chance to dive on hundreds of shipwrecks, and I've seen the impact that a discovery can have on cultural history. I've witnessed how a handful of Lake Michigan shipwrecks have become legendary for what occurred after they were discovered, even more so than at the time of their losses. I'm going to turn it down a little. Yeah, so let's begin with the exciting but sad saga of the Alvin Clark. Is that still loud? Can somebody else there turn that down just a little bit? I can't hear quite the same way. A cold November day in 1967, a commercial fisherman snagged a valuable net. I think we're going to need it louder because there's going to be some talking. He snagged his net on a wreck in Chambers Island. He called some friends. They came out the next year, and let's listen to what they found.
temperature is about 38 degrees. It stays that way all throughout the year. It never changes. And you have to realize also that you only carry so much life on your back.
Life on your back. Hoffman retrieved the net and began to research the sunken schooner. He soon realized it was the wreck of the Alvin Clark. The Alvin Clark was the vision of an entrepreneurial fisherman, John P. Clark, who tried his hand at commercial shipping. This was a new venture that would require his own specialized ship. In 1845, Clark commissioned the building of a two-masted schooner from a shipyard in Tarago, Michigan. He named it for his son Alvin. At that time in our country's history, sailing vessels dominated commercial transportation. Launched in 1846, the Alvin Clark served its owner well for 18 years, carrying such cargo as salt, lumber, and packaged goods throughout the Great Lakes in the days when sugar cost 8 cents a pound and a day's labor earned $1.20. But the career of the Alvin Clark ended on a June day in 1864. Running empty for Oconto, Wisconsin to take on a load of lumber, the Alvin Clark passed the entrance to Sturgeon Bay and headed into the waters of Green Bay. Soon, the skies darkened, but the seas remained calm. And that was a good thing because the Alvin Clark was short-handed that day with only its captain and 4 mates. But within an hour, rain began to fall and the wind picked up. Suddenly, a powerful gust of wind hit the schooner and forced the Alvin Clark hard on its side. Crew member Michael Cray tried to help right the ship, but a second gust capsized the vessel and it began to go down. Clay clambered onto the side of the ship but was thrown into the churning waters. He and only one other lucky crew member survived. The captain and 2 others went down with the Alvin Clark. Then, after more than a century, diver Frank Hoffman decided to give the Alvin Clark a new life.
Taken out of the lift cables, the barge sank about 8 inches in the water. For every 100 turns of the winches, the record raised about 5 inches, and a goal of 100 turns for each man was set by the crew. Sightseers who came to watch the raising of the ship were welcome to come aboard the lift barge only if they would take a turn at the winches.
There you go.
When the barge began to float slightly higher in the water, divers went down for a quick check and discovered that the ship was finally free of the bow. They surfaced and announced that the lift would continue.
Excitement was high when in July 1969, after 2 years of work, the ship finally broke the surface. Thousands of people lined the channel to share in the excitement of this vessel being resurrected from the deep. I wish I had been there. I was just a little kid then. The dive team could finally get a look at the ship, which previously they couldn't see more than a few feet at a time. After 105 years on the bottom of Green Bay, the Alvin Clark had finally reached port. The last effort was to re-step the masts in preparation for the local blessing of the fleet. After 105 years underwater, the ship actually floated on its own. The divers enjoyed the excitement that came to them after this amazing accomplishment, and the public shared their enthusiasm for bringing this ship back into the world. They had the opportunity to walk the decks and go below to experience what it must have been like for the crew. Historians could study and document the ship without the constraints of low visibility, cold water, and scuba gear. And journalists told the story in countless articles and television documentaries. For Frank Hoffman, his dream had come true. His beloved ship had been raised from the grave to have a new career as a tourist attraction in Menominee, Michigan. But from the moment the mast broke the surface, the ship faced a whole new set of problems. The Clark had stabilized in the cold water, but exposed to the heat of summer and the cold of winter, the ship began to dry and crack. Ultimately, Frank Hoffman had made no plans for the care of his ship after it surfaced, and conserving an entire ship is prohibitively expensive. For Frank Hoffman, he had no experience with bureaucracy or grant writing. Ticket sales at the mystery ship seaport soon declined, and the ship began to decay. Hoffman desperately sought donations, but no one would support him. The costs to maintain the Alvin Clark were just too much. In 1994, 25 years after it was raised, the oldest merchant ship in existence had to be bulldozed and moved into a landfill. It is no longer today existing in this world. Frank Hoffman followed his beloved ship to the grave just 3 years later. Although divers never again attempted to raise an entire shipwreck, most continued to help themselves to tempting artifacts. These early divers stripped bare many shipwrecks. By the mid-1980s, people began to realize that this activity was destroying their shipwrecks. What you see here is a reenactment, but this was a common occurrence when I began diving. State governments began to get involved, and so did the federal government. In 1987, President Ronald Reagan signed into law the Abandoned Shipwreck Act, which turned over ownership of any abandoned shipwrecks to the states in which they lay. The state governments then enacted laws that made recovering artifacts without a permit illegal. Most divers obeyed those laws as a way of protecting their sites, but some reacted like the way they did at Prohibition. Some continued to take artifacts. Well, one particular shipwreck found just after the new abandoned shipwreck law underscored the new controversy between divers and governments. When the wreck of the palatial sidewheel steamer Lady Elgin was found in 1998 by a commercial salver, Harry Zeik, it made newspaper headlines around the Midwest.
Memories were all that remained of the Lady Elgin until 1989, 129 years later.
The very first piece that we found that told us about the Lady Elgin's schooner, they had steamboat Lady Elgin engraved in the annals.
Harry Zeik, a well-known Chicago salver, found the sidewheel steamer off the North Shore in an undisclosed location. His proof? Artifacts from the Lady Elgin, like the ship's whistle.
It was the voice of the ship. It was the last thing that was heard that night as the vessel was sinking.
And there are more artifacts. An 1843 Springfield rifle, a sword, a china plate and knife, a chandelier, and the ship's seal.
The Lady Elgin had been built in 1851 to serve the growing passenger and cargo trade from the eastern lakes to Lake Michigan. In 1855, the Lady Elgin changed hands and was used to connect the desolate ports of Lake Superior with the bigger cities along Lake Michigan. In September 1860, it was chartered by the Irish Union Guards, a Democratic militia group based in Milwaukee that had recently been disbanded by Wisconsin's Governor Alexander Randall over political disagreements. They were at odds over the upcoming presidential election, pitting the little giant Stephen Douglas against Abraham Lincoln. The Union Guards arranged an excursion from Milwaukee to Chicago as a fundraising event to repay the debt of 80 refurbished flintlock muskets that they had purchased to rearm their unit. Over 300 people, the Union Guards, their supporters, and another 100 general passengers sailed overnight to Chicago. They arrived there on the morning of Friday, September 7, captured in this photograph, only the second photograph ever taken of this vessel. After a day of sightseeing and a parade to show off their new weapons and their support for Stephen Douglas, the passengers returned to the Lady Elgin at about 10 o'clock that night. Captain John Wilson gave the command to steer the sidewheeler from the dock at about 11 o'clock. And as the Lady Elgin steamed north towards Milwaukee, a fierce wind blew in and it began to rain. At about 2 a.m., Captain Wilson spotted a schooner in the distance and he immediately took action to steer clear to avoid a collision. But the seas did not cooperate and actually pushed the ships towards each other. Captain Wilson watched helplessly as the small schooner headed towards his ship, ultimately striking the side of the vessel and tearing through into the cabin. Water began pouring in, and Captain Wilson realized his ship would sink. In minutes, the engine toppled, splitting the ship in two, and hundreds of men, women, and children were forced into the water.
For those who survived the sea, the nightmare was just beginning. The full force of the thunderstorm struck after the Lady Elgin went down. Flashes of lightning revealed scores of terrified people, unable to swim, climbing onto the backs of cattle, only to drown with them.
The lake was strewn with wreckage, floating bodies, dead and dying, which we could only see when a flash of lightning came. The sounds of prayers and curses were heard on all sides.
The Elgin sank off Highland Park, destroying pushed the survivors and wreckage to an end. The crew of the first lifeboat used their single oar like a rudder, and the wind pushed them toward the neck ravines. As it neared the shore, the breakers suddenly flipped the lifeboat, smashing it against the bluff. Miraculously, all 13 men on board managed to survive.
Saturday morning revealed the horror of the disaster. In dawn's light, lakefront homeowners could see debris from a ship and the bodies of the dead and dying spread out for miles over the lake surface. Special editions of newspapers announced the terrible calamity. At least 300 of the 400 passengers perished. Captain Wilson was among the victims. He had navigated a raft with about 25 souls on board close to shore, but lost his life in the breakers when a timber crushed his skull. As horrific as the accident, the outbreak of civil war after Abraham Lincoln was elected overshadowed the Lady Elgin tragedy. Memories of the accident faded until 1989 when Harry Zeik discovered the wreckage. Zeik faced felony charges for the artifacts that he had removed from the wreck, including a safe that contained about 300 gold and silver coins. Zeik made a clever move in court when he teamed up with the Aetna Insurance Company, which had insured the Lady Elgin. Together, they set out to prove that the Aetna company had never given up ownership of the wreck. If they could prove that, then Zeik couldn't be found guilty of stealing state property. This became a landmark test case fought over the new Abandoned Shipwreck Act, and it would drag on for 10 years. Meanwhile, the state of Illinois sought to document whatever remained on the bottom of the wreck so that the historical information wouldn't be lost. Illinois turned to my organization, the Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago, for one of the first archaeological surveys in Lake Michigan. And what a fascinating survey it was. In time, our team came to learn that there were actually 5 different sites of wreckage spread out for more than a mile over the lake bottom. At the site farthest north, we came upon a debris field, hundreds of items that had obviously spilled out of the Lady Elgin, a giant wrench from the engine room, stairs that once led up to the pilot house, a capstan that helped raise and lower the anchors. And we saw a lot of metal rods on the bottom, might have been ballast, a spittoon, hand trucks that would have been used to load the luggage of the passengers, even a newfangled cook stove. There were actually about 4 cook stoves being shipped to a store up in Lake Superior. And then we saw some more iron rods on the bottom. We thought it was more ballast, but when we looked closely, we realized these were weapons, the very muskets purchased by the Irish Union Guards. Now, about 1,000 feet south of the debris field, we found 2 giant boilers. Now, the ship was more than 250 feet long, and there was certainly a lot of wooden structure, but here we found just these 2 big pieces of machinery. Obviously, they had toppled out of the ship, probably at the time of the collision when the ship was ripped open. They're laying on their sides, disarticulated. Now, about a quarter mile south of there, one of the paddle wheels, and then 500 feet from there, the other paddle wheel, these were once connected. Now, fully a half a mile south of there, we started to run into pieces of the ship's hull. What you're seeing there is structure that's actually the starboard side of the ship, the frames that once held it together. At what would have been the bow, we saw a giant woodstock anchor. That chain is paying out through a hose pipe, and it goes over to a wooden windlass. This is a spool-like device that was a mechanical device used to raise and lower those anchors. Amazing sight. Well, 1999, 10 years after Harry Zike began that case, he was actually awarded ownership of the Lady Elgin, but it did come with a price. Although he got to keep the gold and silver coins and other artifacts he had recovered, the frustrating and costly legal battle could not have been worth it. The legal fight over the Lady Elgin revealed some weak points in the new law, but it also underscored how hard the government was going to fight to support that law. Unwilling to fight the government, most divers gave up hunting artifacts and began working to protect shipwrecks. Coincidentally, at about that same time that the law was established, underwater video and still cameras were becoming more affordable for your average recreational divers. And the accidental introduction of zebra mussels into the Great Lakes at the time had a side effect beneficial to divers. These filter-feeding mollusks actually clean up the water so that visibility is increased dramatically from those early days like you saw with the Alvin Clark when you could only see a few feet in front of your diving mask. Now we can regularly see anywhere from 50 to 150 feet underwater, as this video attests. This particular wreck, the Thomas Hume, is 150 feet deep, about 50 miles that way in Lake Michigan. So divers began working with archaeologists to document shipwrecks for the historical record. My own career has spanned the transition from the wholesale stripping of shipwrecks to the preservation of them. In 1994, I met a Michigan-based diver, Jack Van Heest, on an archaeological project on a wreck in Lake Huron. We married a couple years later, and I moved across the lake to Holland, Michigan. Eager to stay involved in shipwreck documentation, my husband and I founded the Michigan Shipwreck Research Association to search for and document shipwrecks and interpret them for the historical record. We understand how the discovery of a shipwreck provides a tangible connection to our past and offers an enticing reason to study history. Over the past 14 years, we've partnered with sonar operator David Trotter using his sonar equipment and our boat. We've also been working with nationally acclaimed author Clive Cussler and his associate Ralph Wilbanks, an archaeologist and a sonar operator. So far, we found more than a dozen new shipwrecks off the shores of West and Southwest Michigan, some becoming legendary for what was revealed by studying the shipwreck. Our discovery of the H.C. Akeley refuted survivor accounts of where the vessel sank and offered an understanding of the ship not previously known. Our discovery of the car ferry Ann Arbor No. 5 just off South Haven changed what was known about that vessel. It was assumed to have been scrapped, but it said it sank on the way to the scrapyard. And our study of the shipwreck Thomas Hume that you saw in the video solved the mystery of its sinking and generated an enormous amount of archaeological information. And our discovery of another shipwreck proved legendary as well. Finding this shipwreck changed what was known about the history of bulk cargo freighters on the Great Lakes. A few years ago, we set out to locate the wreck of what we presumed to be just an old barge. Little had been written about the ship. We learned that it had been built in 1888, named the George C. Dyer to serve in the iron ore trade. We found accounts that it had suffered a fire in 1902 in Lake Erie, and then was subsequently purchased by a quarry operator in Belgium, Wisconsin, who then rebuilt the ship to ship stone from Wisconsin to Chicago for use in the construction and steel industries. At that point in time, it was named the Hennepin, and one source indicated that an elevator belt was added, but it didn't provide any other information. By 1926, the 40-year-old ship was purchased by the Construction Materials Company out of Chicago to haul limestone from Grand Haven back to Chicago for use in the steel industry. To make room for more cargo, the company removed its engine and used a tugboat to tow it. That's the way it works. That ship left Grand Haven on a calm August day in 1927 on what would be its last delivery. After unloading the cargo of gravel in Chicago, Captain Ole Hansen and his crew set about securing the tow line from the Hennepin to the tugboat Lotus. Over on the Lotus, the crew was taking care of the tow line on their end and getting the ship set for the long haul across the lake. The Hennepin was riding light, in other words, empty, on that return trip to Grand Haven. The lake was calm that day, but as usual for an old ship, it was taking on some water in its seams, and the crew had to keep 10 bilge pumps in operation. On the tugboat, the crew kept an eye on the tow line and tended to their other duties. They kept watch on the steam in the boiler, they checked the gauges, and they greased up the engine, and then settled in for the long haul back to Grand Haven. Keeping an eye on that tow line through the whole trip. But at about 10:30 in the morning on board the Hennepin, a crew member noticed that the pumps weren't keeping up with the water that was coming in. One of the crew members who was supposed to be keeping the filters cleaned out must have been slacking. Captain Hansen and the others took action to try to staunch the flow of water, but by 2:30 that afternoon, they realized it was a losing battle. They were going to have to abandon the Hennepin. A crew member blew the whistle to get the attention of the tugboat, and that tugboat quickly slowed and came around to retrieve the crew. They saved what they could from the crew cooler, meat, and a brass clock. And then they launched the lifeboat and rowed away from the Hennepin. Nobody panicked. The crew of the Hennepin made it safely on board the tugboat. And then the two captains had to confer. What would they do? Hoping against hope, they decided to try to make for Grand Haven, towing the half-sunk Hennepin behind them, always ready to cut that tow line if the worst should happen. But by late afternoon, it was clear that the Hennepin was not going to make it back to Grand Haven. As it wallowed deeper in the water, the tugboat released that tow line. They stayed close and kept a eye on the Hennepin until about 6 o'clock, when it slowly began sinking beneath the waves. Imagine that. And then a few pieces of the galley house popped up. They couldn't leave that structure floating as a hazard to other ships, so Captain Hansen decided to ram it and break it up into smaller pieces. Boy, Captain Hansen must have been distraught. Already behind his prime, he must have wondered if he was ever going to get command of another ship, and wondered if he would be forever connected to this sinking. Well, indeed, in his obituary just a few years later, he was listed as the man who sank the Hennepin. Not a good way to go to your grave. Well, when the Lotus finally reached Grand Haven several hours later, all Captain Hansen could think to do was call across the water and tell him, boy, it was a storm out there. She died a hard death. That was his story. Well, he later conferred with newspaper reporters and indicated that his ship had gone down in that storm in 203 feet of water, somewhere off South Haven. So thankfully, that gave us as shipwreck hunters some clues for where to look. Well, he was right on target, and indeed, after just 3 days of searching, we had a target. Now, let's go beneath the water, 230 feet. This is about 18 miles off South Haven, and right away, we knew this was the Hennepin. There's the tow rope still in place, just the way they left it. It passes beyond a capstan. There's what would have been the wheelhouse. You still see the wheel in pristine condition there. The wheelhouse must have popped off. That must have been the structure that they rammed. Now this was interesting because the blueprints we had of the ship only indicated it had one wheel, but this tells us that they had an auxiliary wheel for steam-powered steering. Early powered steering. How about that? Now just below what would have been the pilot house, below the wheel, you see a bell there that was at one time mounted on the pilot house. It must have just conveniently fallen off the pilot house and dropped right into the ship. Perfect for us to study all these years later. And now what we're seeing is what we suspect to be that elevator belt. You see what would have been rollers. It would have had a belt on those rollers, a conveyor belt, but after all those years underwater, the belt itself must have decayed. That belt runs into this tall standing A-frame midships. Now, interestingly, this stands about 40 feet from the surface, the deck of the boat, still standing after all those years. Now we're heading aft of that A-frame structure. You see the smokestack there. The smokestack has toppled off the top of the boiler house. But there's the boiler house with one of the ventilators that let the hot air out, still standing, perfectly still. Now accounts indicated that the Hennepin had 2 boilers, but we're seeing just 1 boiler on the ship, so we realized when they removed the engine, they probably took away one of the boilers, again, to make room for more cargo. The aft section of the ship is very damaged. But after that first dive, we realized that the Hennepin looks surprisingly like modern self-unloading freighters. We also realized that the elevator belt, in fact, was a conveyor belt system that ran the length of the hold up to a conveyor belt on deck that helped unload the vessel. We found this great historic picture of the Hennepin. We also found the patent drawings for the unloading system that had been installed on the Hennepin, the first ever such system. The equipment that we documented underwater was the prototype, significant because it replaced manpower, simply an early technology for downsizing. Imagine that. Where have we heard that before? So since 1902, this type of equipment has been copied and improved upon, and it now represents the primary method to unload vessels, revolutionary for its simplicity. Soon after the Hennepin was retrofitted, self-unloaders became the most common boats on the Great Lakes. The lake's largest self-unloader, the 1,000-foot Paul R. Tregurtha, was modeled after plans of the Hennepin, and you can only appreciate it when looking at it sideways. 1 year after discovering the Hennepin, we nominated the shipwreck to the National Register of Historic Places as the first self-unloading ship. Divers now regularly visit the Hennepin to study this fascinating and terribly significant ship. Well, after considering the losses and the discoveries of the 3 ships that I talked about today, it becomes clear that these ships live on after they sink. They become underwater attractions for recreational divers. They become laboratories for archaeologists and historians. They provide the data that can help solve the mystery of their sinkings. They offer up information to help us writers pen the final chapters of these vessels' careers. And they generate exciting information to share with the public in presentations like this and in museum exhibits. Most assuredly, the saga of these many ships did not end when the waves of Lake Michigan washed over them. Thank you very much.